Welcome back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. And this week, we're speaking with Ian Levine, a major player in the angel investing, startup, and VC community here in Boston. And we have the privilege to speak with him about his wealth of experience in this space, in this area, and maybe a little bit of an opportunity to evangelize why Boston should be higher in the startup evaluation when you were thinking of where to start. I think we've got something for San Francisco and Austin. So, Ian, would you like to share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I'll sort of start with modern day and work backward and take us back to the dark ages. Today I'm a managing director of Launchpad Ventures. I've been with Launchpad for 6 years. We're the largest seed funder of companies in New England over the last 25 years. And we define seed as, 500,000 to 2.5 million type investments where we lead a priced round. I've been an active angel investor for 20 years. I've tried a couple of my own startups, some successful, some not successful, from ideation to code build all the way through growth and exit, or growth and close down. I've had both experiences.
One's better than the other.
Yeah. And then before that, I spent nearly 30 years in the corporate world, and sales is primarily my background. That's where I started. I worked my way up to management. I ran lots of large teams, up to 1,000 people, and lots of different competencies. But go-to-market, M&A, those are the things that I think I really shined at and became my passions during my career.
That's awesome. And folks, before we started, Ian and I were sharing some war stories over how sales have changed over the years. I came on the scene, as many of you know, in the late 90s after my time in the Marines, and even earlier. And we're just talking about some of the differences in how sales and sales operations has worked over, that period of time. It's pretty crazy. Ian, you mentioned you started off primarily in sales. What are the big differences that you've seen for the audience?
Well, I started in the 80s. My very first thing, there was no CRM. So The very first thing I had to do is figure out, what's my patch, because I was hired without a official territory. So I had to go meet with all.
I'm sorry to interrupt. That part still happens. A startup hires the salesperson, then figures out how to work with them.
Yeah, I like it. And there was no laptop. There was I had my day planner, and I basically look back at my day planner, and it really was a CRM, the way I organized my life. And organization was still really important. Who have you called? What was said? Capture all the information. When's the next follow-up or next best action? And so that part hasn't changed, but it's just all electronic today with 10,000, literally 10,000 pieces of software that you could choose to use to help you to do it.
Yeah. And, interesting when it comes to startups, I do a lot of advising in startups, mostly ideation, early stage stuff. And I always tell them, don't be too eager to buy a bunch of SaaS products. Overhead equals death. I started out with a notebook. You can start off with Google Suites and grow from there.
It's funny. I'll tell you a story. So one of my roles during my career, I spent 5 years of head of sales strategy and operations at Iron Mountain, Fortune 500
I know
company.
them.
And I had a very large budget. I think it was $175 million budget. So everybody's trying to sell me all the great sales tools that are out there. And two things. I was running about 20 different pieces of software to run sales, which is a lot. So I had to turn to my team because everybody kept coming in with the next great thing they wanted to do that someone had convinced them to use. And I sort of said, okay, we can bring this in as long as we get rid of one of the 20. So you need to convince me not only how good this is, but which one is better than that we're always using. The other thing I'll tell you is, even though we did have a full stack and felt like we shouldn't take in too much more, we met with startup vendors constantly every week, and we'd bring in team members. And the reason we did it is they were doing a really good job of bringing us market knowledge, insights, what's working in the market, what's not. Sure, they were trying to sell us their software or their service, but we were learning a ton from the vendors. So we gave them access to us to get to know us, and we got to know them. And the reason we were doing it was almost like one of these learning lunches where the vendors trying to sell us something, but they're showing up with great insights and great business cases for us to contemplate.
I love that. And I'll tell you, interestingly, so many of you know, I started my career in the technology staffing industry, started as a recruiter, moved to sales management, owned my own firms, all that stuff. But when I transitioned from recruiting to sales, in those days, people in the staffing industry, we acted in many ways as business consultants to our clients. And quick, funny story, one of my early large clients was the Boston Federal Reserve Bank. And when I first started working with them, as probably will come as a surprise to no one, they were very formal in how relationships had to be. And the AVP at the time, I thought he didn't like me. He was just very stoic, very formal. Fast forward, we worked together for about 15 or so years. He retires from the bank and calls me and he's like, Jerry, always loved working with you, never able to express it. I'm starting a consulting company. How do I do that? And our relationship evolved from call me Mr. X to how do I start a business in that period of time. And it was a two-part thing. Number one, he was one of my larger clients for a significant period of time. But from my perspective, I was able to help him with what's happening in the market, what the talent landscape looks like, different technologies that are coming up in the New England market, and different ones that are harder to find. It was much as you described.
Yeah, well, you crossed the trust barrier. You earned the trust, and that led to a relationship. And so once that's accomplished, everything's different.
Yes.
I want to double click back on a question you asked earlier about what's changed in sales. The other big change is most purchase decisions used to be made by one person.
Yes.
And that is rarely the case today. It's
Yes.
like no matter what you're selling, there's usually, if it's any scale of a solution, there's going to be between 5 and 15 people involved in the decision.
I don't care if it's 3 dudes in a basement startup or a Fortune 500 company. If they're buying more than a pack of pencils, it's a committee decision. I couldn't agree more. And that is such a culture change for me, because it used to be, again, using the staffing example, I'd have a line manager sign a staffing agreement and we'd work with them, and that was the end of the story. But nowadays, even small, I do, predominantly consulting now, but even a small leadership workshop that I'm doing for a small company, and it's a committee decision, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, and if you're a startup, you got to think about group dynamics in a
Yes.
purchase. It's just groups act differently than individuals, and you've got to think through that, and then you actually have to identify everybody's buying persona. Are they the executive sponsor? Are they the process owner?
Yes.
Are they the system owner? Are they an end user? Just how do they fit into the puzzle of what you're trying to show them, and make sure that your talk track when you're addressing each one of them hits each person.
I'll take it one step further, because you never start with the committee. You've always got an entry point. Ideally, it's whoever the stakeholder is that has the most to gain from your working solution, so they become your champion. But you've got to be able to speak through your person so they can sell getting a meeting for you enough that you get the opportunity to do that. Because I've had several deals die in the cold loneliness of picking the wrong champion.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. You look at the dozens of well-known sales methodologies out there. A champion is almost always part of the equation, and getting that person to shepherd you through the committee. That it's even more important now than ever.
Agree, and I'll go one step further. You mentioned champion. There's a million different types out there. You and I have probably been through dozens of them. But one thing that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, is the nemesis. The people that you're selling, not against in the sense that it's another vendor, but the people that have a vested interest in another party winning. It can be something as much as a family member works for the other company to just someone who doesn't want to change their workflow. So understanding the mental states of all the people involved can be huge, because you don't want to expend a ton of energy trying to convert a nemesis that's never, going to convert.
Yeah, no, that's your. I think the term is blocker. Who's your blocker? Who's blocking your next step? Who's blocking the process? Who's blocking the purchase decision?
Yes. Now you mentioned Iron Mountain, excuse me, and in your present role, you're also working in the New England market. I'd like to switch gears just a little bit. There are so many incredible companies here in the Boston market, in Massachusetts, and New England at large. And I might be somewhat selfish because I live here too in saying this, but I don't think that Boston gets the notoriety it deserves for its startup ecosystem, and just for all we have going on. And frankly, it's been forever. Microsoft has been in Cambridge since forever. Gosh, I used to do sessions at the Center there all the time. We've always had a robust community. It just never gets talked about.
It's funny. I was at the Boston Pitch World Cup at the Microsoft Nerd Center
Yep.
2 nights
Oh
ago.
my gosh.
I was one of the I was one of the judges there. It's just funny you mentioned that. Yeah. So there is so much going on in Boston. It's hard to put into scale for people. I do believe a lot of it starts with the university system and the colleges in the area. There's, besides having some of the highest concentration of world class colleges maybe anywhere in the world, there's also a ton of entrepreneurship programs locally, and then some areas that are getting a lot of startups that actually have sort of a lot of girth in the Boston area. And so you add all that up, it's just incredible how many companies there are. We're one angel group in the greater Boston area, and we get roughly 350 to 400 applications a year. Think about that. And we are definitely not seeing everything that's out there. Those are new ideas that have germinated, that have reached their MVP stage. Maybe some of them are scaling already, but it just gives you an idea of how much startup opportunity and startup activity there is in the Boston area.
Absolutely, yes. And by the time this episode airs, it likely will have passed. But Ian and I will be at the Boston Startup Week as well. And I'm super excited for that. I'll be talking about my book on stage, Destination Employer. I'll be doing some live recording there as well. But I can't wait to see all of the entrepreneurs. And what's exciting, Ian mentioned colleges. Suffolk University is hosting us, and a lot of their student entrepreneurs and what Stephanie from Boston Startup calls startup curious folks will be there, and I'm super excited to see them. One last thing, and I'll turn the mic back over. You mentioned incredible schools. My oldest son is a WPI alum. He works at Amazon Robotics in their optics department now. My daughter's a Hampshire College alum, and my third child just went off to Boston this past Wednesday for her first year at college and joining the campus there. So the school system here is incredible all over Massachusetts, but Boston specifically.
Yeah, I actually want to give a shout out to Stephanie and everything she's doing for the Boston ecosystem. Startup Boston's quite an event. I'm also, it's going to probably be after the fact, but I'm actually moderating a panel there in September. And after the fact, that in the sense that this will air after Startup Boston. But it's just one thing for anybody listening to think about. Our panel is going to be on the use of debt for startups instead of equity. Everybody's like, I've got to go find angels. I got to go find VCs. Well, there are other ways to finance your startup. And so, that's what our session is going to be on at Startup Boston.
I love talking to finance folks because I've utilized finance twice in two of my startups, and I didn't go about it the traditional way either time. The first time, our company was a part of the Salesforce ecosystem. We're a MuleSoft consulting company, and we were their partner of the year for all three categories, I think 3 years in a row. And our growth started to slow down, and they came to us and said, hey, you're slowing down. What's going on? We said, we're kind of running a little bit short on cash, and they funded us. So it wasn't the traditional go hunting, pitch a million people. Salesforce Ventures just hit us, and we went with them. And then the second time, when I started my company, Redbeard, a lot of the same familiar faces from the Apicero days, I went to one of them and said, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? He said, well, here's some money. And that was it. That was it. So I've never experientially had to do those things. Now, you're both an angel investor and a seed VC. When you're looking at funding, Ian, is that a different look when you're looking personally as an angel versus as someone running a VC fund, or is it the same mindset?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So first of all, your two fundings, one I would call a strategic funding. So you found a strategic that saw value in what you were doing, and so they funded you. And then the second is the most common form of startup funding, friends and family.
Yes.
That's what it's usually called. Yeah. So Launchpad's a little bit unusual. There's a couple dozen angel groups like us in the country. It's sort of like uh, once you get up over that $1 million threshold, and there's no official rule as to how many money, that sort of puts you into the seed sort of, and now you're competing with the lower VCs. To be clear, we are still an angel
Oh,
group.
okay. I'm
We
sorry.
are not a venture capitalist, even though it's Launchpad Venture Group. We are an angel group, but we have 175 members in the Boston area, and they're primarily either former founders. We're really proud that a whole bunch of the folks that we have founded that had great exits came back, joined us, and now they're using their knowledge and money to help support the ecosystem. And an awful lot of C-level people from the Boston area, basically, giving back to the community, both in terms of dollars and lessons learned to help startups hit goals faster, not run out of money, grow better, etc. So I don't know if I answer your question because I did a lot of clarifying there.
Yeah, that's because I misrepresented you, so it's fair. So my question was, and maybe the question doesn't make sense now. When you're looking at making an angel investment in a firm, is there a different rubric or a different set of metrics than if you're making a VC investment in a firm?
Yeah, no, okay, yeah. So it sort of gets into the pre-seed stage, and let's just sort of stick around technology. If you go into like regulatory environments where it's all about getting my medical device approved or my drug through clinical trials, the rubric's very different. But for a technology company, which we have just a ton of, probably 60-70% of what comes out of Boston fits the technology sort of bucket, and the 30-40% fits the med device health tech bucket, something like that. But on the technology side, it's you basically go to friends and family to get your MVP built usually. You then go to angels when you sort of say, I have a few customers, you using this, I need a little bit more money to prove this out. And then it's somewhere around that few $100,000 to almost $1 million in revenue, you're ready for a seed investment. That's kind of the metrics. And that's where angel groups and some smaller VCs get that's where Launchpad, us, and some smaller VCs get very interested. Most VCs actually want you at the next stage, which is typically referred to as Series A. And that's the scaling phase. So you kind of go from MVP, and we're sort of in the get more customers and just finish proving the product market fit. And then you get into revenue and revenue scaling. And the majority of venture capitalists are really interested in the revenue scaling phase. There's definitely smaller VCs and boutique VCs that come downstream toward where we play, but there's not a lot of them. Venture capital in general as a category is mostly Series A, B, C, D, E focused. And there's smaller regional ones that are sort of A, dropping down to seed, and then once in a great while doing a pre-seed investment.
That's interesting. Now, you mentioned what the business culture or business vertical culture is here in New England as it, technology, I think biotech, med device. I also think there's some finance, fintech as well. But when I think fintech or finance, I tend to think more Hartford, New York. But up in Massachusetts, I typically see biotech, bioscience, convenience on med devices, and just tons of tech, raw tech stuff.
Yeah, so there's a very strong fintech sort of string of folks and people and ideas and companies, clean tech, ed tech, Your classic SaaS. There's some gaming tech stuff going on. We've got a lot of robotics. It's really pretty broad. It used to be people think, okay, well, it's either, a drug or a piece of software, but there's a lot more sort of subcategories going on.
Yeah, I was surprised. As I mentioned, my son's in robotics. He works for Amazon Robotics. But when he was looking prior to going to Amazon for different companies, I was surprised by the amount of robotics companies in Massachusetts. I had never realized how many there were.
Yeah, it's not my vertical of expertise, but I believe the University of Lowell runs an unbelievable program on robotics. You mentioned WPI earlier. Obviously,
Yes.
they're strong in that as well. So yeah, and MIT, some of the best robotic
Of
things that
course.
have come out in the world came out of MIT. So yeah, we just triangulated most of Boston.
Exactly. But that goes back to the genesis of my argument that Boston doesn't get the credit it deserves for being a startup hub.
Yeah, I think we do get credit. I mean, if you look back at the data a decade ago, we had a strong number two
Oh,
position
really?
after Silicon Valley.
Okay.
Yeah, you're going back. But to your point, a lot of communities put a lot of money, time, and there's a lot of state funds working to do it. And Austin, Texas is now a big hub. And obviously, New York City's become a bigger hub. Chicago's a bigger hub. There's unbelievable in Southern California is a hub. I mean, it's really proliferated in terms of where startups go. We're always going to have an advantage with our universities. We just are. But the state funds do make a difference. And I'll be honest, there's some great Massachusetts programs. There's some good Rhode Island, Maine, Connecticut programs. But some of the programs that I've heard about to support the ecosystem in the central US, there's some really big dollars, much bigger than we see in the Northeast, going in to turn, Cleveland, Cincinnati, these places into startup hubs. Serious money.
Yeah, I can't recall now which state it was. It was one of the Midwest states. But I was talking to a friend who'd started a cybersecurity firm, and she had mentioned that the resources from the state were incredible.
Yeah, there's an angel group out there, A plus angel group that got backed by I think $100 million
Wow.
from the state to say, use this money along with all your angel money to make sure we fund the startup community. That's a big commitment. Now, let's not overly pick on Massachusetts. Massachusetts has Mass Ventures. There are programs here to help startups. It's just of a different scale than I'm seeing in other states.
Let me shift the conversation, if I may, just a little bit. It's not often I have somebody on who has not only a depth of experience you do, but the breadth as an angel investor across the amount of startups that you touched. When you're talking to a startup, or even better yet, when you're talking to someone who's in ideation, what advice would you give to increase the likelihood of success of their startup? I mean, gosh, 93% fail rate in 2023 is not a great number.
Yeah, well, I think it starts with iterate and surround yourself with really smart people. Keep talking to people that have been there, done that. Build that network around yourself to sort of avoid pitfalls. You're still going to have setbacks and pitfalls, but there's a lot of lessons learned that you're only going to pick up by talking to lots and lots of people. Don't spend money too fast. Bootstrap the best you can for as long as you can. There's definitely inflection points where that's no longer the right strategy, but early on, it's definitely the right strategy. Unfortunately, and this is a little past ideation. I mean, ideation funding really does typically come from friends and families, but you do need to constantly be thinking about your runway, in terms of your personal time, the cash for the business, and specifically what milestones can you hit. And if I hit that next milestone, that theoretically should loosen up some purse strings to help me get to the next milestone. And when you're talking to people and getting advice, try to tease out those milestones. In other words, you're an angel, you're an active angel, you like my space. What would it take for you to invest? What would you need to see from my company? How far do I need to take this? And when you get those milestones, they really help you sort of figure out, how to get there. It's sort of like you need to know where the finish line is for that milestone so you can charge toward it, as opposed to worrying about, a year from now, 2 years from now, et cetera. And by the way, that same advice goes even as you grow. You gotta keep worrying about, do I have enough money for the next milestone? Do I have enough money for the next milestone?
No, I love that. And you said something I'd like to dial back to, and that's talking to people. One of the consistent mistakes I see a lot of startup founders make is, number one, they sit on their MVP too long. They don't release it, and so they wind up going too far down a road that's not the right road. The second thing I see is isolation. Being a founder is kind of a lonely job. It's the nature of the beast. But by plugging yourself into a community, not only do you get some support, but you get people to bounce ideas off of, so you can avoid a lot of those dead ends and those pitfalls that you'd otherwise step in. I've got two friends that run two different communities. Trenton Hughes, who runs a community called Tribe HQ, and it's mostly a little bit more established startups, whether they're bootstrapped or funded, but they're on their way. I've got another friend, Eric Harrison, who runs Thrive Group, which is specifically a bootstrap community. And I speak in both groups, and I'm active in both groups. But the common thread is founders talking to founders about founder things, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, so I have two different points I want to make. The first on the community. Boston, I'm still meeting all the great people in the community every day. I meet new people every time I go to an event, but I had no idea, even a year or two ago, I had no idea how many accelerators and pitch contests go on in the Boston area, both of which are worth getting involved with for different reasons. An accelerator is a point in time decision, but there's dozens of really good accelerators out there. And the thing is, if you go in and apply to an accelerator, even if you don't get it, often you'll be given some good feedback,
Yes.
or a connection that can help you. So it's not always about getting into the accelerator. It's just getting better known in the community. And the overwhelming majority of the people that are running these things, they're in it to make money, but they really want to help people.
Yeah.
That's why they're doing this, and they have a passion for startups. So that's one thing. It's interesting, your comment on this is the second thing, on the comment on releasing a product, just holding back to get it to perfect. I actually see two different scenarios with that. I see the salesy founder getting it out there when it's barely around second base or just approaching third base. And I have the tech founder or the engineering founder who isn't happy after he's touched home 4 times in a row. It's different mentalities. There is zero doubt in my mind, and I come from a sales background, so you know where I'm going with this. You do not look for perfection. You've got to get it into the hands of some end users to try.
Yeah.
And because, first of all, whatever you draw on a whiteboard is probably, your thesis hopefully is right, but what you're drawing on the whiteboard is probably 20% to 30% wrong. It's sort of like, when it gets into the hands, new information is going to come forward about workflows, about business cases, about pain points that you didn't have in your original thesis or original idea.
150% yes. What you write on your whiteboard is what you think the answer is. When you talk to your community of users, you find out what the answer is. I know when I was writing my book, it was the same thing. I got my own head. It's 30 years of experience in 200 pages, so I want to make sure I could get as much as I could. But you get trapped in your own head. Then I started talking to people, and I realized how many wrong roads I went down, and had to make pretty significant changes in the book. And it's the same way with a service offering or a product. It's so easy to get stuck in your own head and put out what you think the answer is. And then you're all excited and you finally show it to your customers, and they're like, no. And then you're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, no, I've lived it. Trust me, I've lived it.
Yes, no, but I just see it all the time, and you're right. It's so funny too. So you and I both come from a sales background, so we look at, I would imagine, not to put words in your mouth, we look at the world through that lens. But most founders are technical folks, and let's face it. Again, our moms taught us not to stereotype, but here I am. Most tech folks got to tech because they want to make cool stuff. It's not the people part of it that they like. So they want to sit there and play with their toy until they're ready to show it off. Instead of getting it out in front of somebody who can say, that's neat, but before they put too much work.
Yeah, and so here's the other sort of lesson that I have is so sales has changed a lot in the
Yes.
last 15 years, and it's become very automated. A lot of people have dissected it, broke it down. It used to be considered all art, and these people have turned it into as much of a science as possible. And they've built all these workflows and mind maps and all these other things that so everybody's like, I want a coin operated playbook. I want to take all the guesswork out of my revenue forecasting and all this sort of stuff. Well, I'm here to tell you, sales is not linear. And what I see with technical founders is they grab onto this concept of process flow that's become so popular, and they engineer the process, and they've got their product, and they're trying to bring it to market following this exact process, because that's the way their minds work. They're very detail oriented. Yes. They're very linear thinkers, and sales just doesn't work that way. Yes, I'm not saying no to the science and the process. I'm just saying it is definitely adaptation. Sales, the best salespeople I've ever been around just adapt quickly to a changing situation. Back to that at the very beginning, we talked about group dynamics. The minute you're going down one path and winning the business case, and that blocker makes a comment, you better address that blocker and change your talk track. Yeah. And that's not necessarily in the sales process. It's not in the, I wanted to move my opportunity from stage 2 to stage 3. It's not in the information what just happened. It's and so anyway, no. I just going off on a technical founders. By the way, I've had success with both, technical founders and sales founders, and I find that I have a lot better product with my technical founders, especially early. But I've got survival revenue with my salesy leaders.
I really believe so. Actually, before I go off on yet another tangent, I can clearly tell that you and I could talk for hours. I'm going to say this: in the 70s, they had the tin siding guys and the used car salespeople, and I think the ideal salesperson is somewhere between that gross extreme on one side and the pure engineering mindset on the other. Because having the steps in a legitimate process is useful, especially in training junior and mid-level salespeople. But there's always going to be an element of art. To Ian's point, when that blocker makes you make an unexpected left, where a salesperson can break out of the process, utilize their understanding of psychology and group dynamics to get the conversation back on track, and then go back forward with the process. So I hope there will always be some level of art. If ever that's not the case, then AI wins, and I are probably both out of jobs.
Well, this is good. This next statement's going to ruin all my interviews for the next 20 years.
Let's stop here then.
My favorite interview question when I'm interviewing somebody for sales, sales management, or sales operations, something like that, typically was, do you think sales is science or art? And then the individual would answer, and there's no right or wrong answer. And then I'd say, well, explain that to me. Why do you think that? And it was so interesting because you knew who you were getting by the way they answered that question. Because it's you can answer it either way and be right, but it just opened up the mind of the candidate to. For me, I got to learn, okay, this is how this candidate thinks, and does that fit with what I'm going to be asking them to do? And by the way, if it's super cerebral, but it's off to one side or the other, probably that's still somebody you're going to hire. It's just as long as they made a good business case.
Yes. And, interesting. I've at this point hired and trained hundreds of salespeople, both for my own companies and for clients' companies. And one of the most interesting things that I've found when it comes to salespeople, like you were describing, is that even I don't say worst, that's mean spirited, even the least skilled salespeople can typically sell themselves. So I found one of the best ways to interview them is to ask them something that makes them uncomfortable, because there's a lot of that in sales, and then see how they answer questions once they're uncomfortable. So general questions like you described are great. Ask them to describe their most recent challenge and how they dealt with it, their biggest failure. I've had a lot of success to kind of get them off their track so I can see as much as I can the real person. But
yeah, show a little vulnerability.
I'll say salespeople are the toughest. I would say the toughest sales. I consider recruiter salespeople, but salespeople and recruiters are some of the toughest because everything about their skill is wired into their connection. But and you mentioned engineers. I'll tell you, I've had a lot of success hiring nearly every background. The background and this might surprise some people, I've had the least success in hiring salespeople from is customer service. And at first I thought it would be a natural, customer service, you're dealing with people in a heightened emotional state. They're used to volume, all that stuff. The problem I found, though, is a salesperson's job when they get someone in an emotional state is to throw gas on that fire. A customer services person's job is to put a wet blanket on that fire. And I just couldn't seem to get, I'm not saying it's never happened, but for the majority, I couldn't seem to get those folks to throw gas instead of a wet blanket when things got hot.
Yeah. So sales profile. Yeah. Let's bring this back to your audience. A couple of things that I see in startups around sales. First of all, it usually starts with founder-led sales. Even if it's a technical founder, they've got to find those first early users. Yes. I sometimes tell people it's around 10 different corporate accounts or something. You sort of, okay, you're kind of there. Forget about the revenue. You've got enough users on this to sort of you've reached critical mass. But the founder then starts selling, and let's say it's going pretty well, and they're ready to hire their first salesperson. And I've heard this math 100 times. Well, I'm the founder. I'm building the product. I'm pitching. I'm raising money. I'm dealing with hiring people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm selling roughly 20% of my time. And last year I sold 500,000. So when I hire a full-time sales rep, I think they should do 2.5 million. And the reality is, even the technical founder who has, let's just assume average to below average sales skills, is still going to be the best salesperson for the first 5 years of the business. It's like, so they're way underselling themselves and way over, back to this sales isn't linear. Well, you can't just say I've returned this much time, so the output's going to be X greater. It just doesn't work. The other question that comes up a lot is, when do I hire that VP of sales? Yes. When do I bring in that sales powerhouse, and where do I find them? What's the profile? And that's a trickier one. But I will say this: I don't think you need a sales VP until you're several million up into sales. Now, if you have a founder, salesperson, that's a different discussion. If you have 2 or 3 founders and one of them sales, you just put them in charge of sales, and that's that. But that's not usually the case. Either the salesy person's either the founder and they're going to be the CEO, or they're anyway. They got to find this VP. So that's kind of thing. But even then, even at a few million or whatever, that person cannot be a paper pusher. They've still got to be on every critical sales call. And so, it's active combat, and that's a huge difference, because a VP of sales in a larger company is an entirely different job than a VP of sales in a startup, say sub 5 million, sub 10 million, because we talked at the very beginning about the different stages. It's like scaling is a more venture capital time. Series A, B, C, D. And then there's different, depending on where you are in your scaling, there's just different skill sets you need there. And it becomes much more about a leadership thing too, then as well.
When I was doing a lot of classes in my old company, Influence Understood, one of the most popular was a workshop on how to prepare to hire for a salesperson. And I couldn't agree more. Several things I could unpack an hour conversation in your brief statement, Ian. But one is the difference in roles and stages in a company. But I will die on this hill as someone who's been a long-time sales leader. The VP of sales, director of sales, your sales leader, wherever they're titled in your company, is one of the most mishired and misused roles in all companies until they get to enterprise level. They make the player coach mistake where you've got a person that you want to sell a full book of business and run a team, or you make the mistake of going the other way and it's a purely administrative role. I couldn't agree more. Your early stage sales leader needs to be supporting the team, needs to be building a pipeline so they have salespeople when you need them. There's so much to that role, and it's rarely dealt with well. The last thing I want to talk about, and we're already 40 minutes in, so I'll be as brief as I can. In nearly everything you said today, one of the things I couldn't agree with more is the founder has to be the first salesperson. And it's just not, there's no option there. They're going to speak to their product better than anybody else. They're going to have the gravitas that being a founder brings that nobody's going to have. They need to be and they can't, in my opinion, they shouldn't even consider hiring a salesperson until they can walk that salesperson through what selling their product is like. And that doesn't happen until they've sold 5-10 times at least, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree on the founder issue, or the founder being the first salesperson. But then you've got to bring somebody in who's very good at teasing out, the ideal customer profile. Make sure you've got that figured out,
Yes.
and what's your value prop, how you're going to tell your story. The sort of the next generation. Those aren't necessarily what the founder specializes in, but I'm all in on the founders in the early days is the salesperson.
Yeah,
and raising money, by the way, is also a sales job.
100%, yes. And one other thing on sales, discovery will never not be important. Obviously, discovery is always critical in any sales cycle. You can't sell if you don't know. But in the beginning, especially, because that discovery is more than, is Ian my ideal prospect? That discovery is, what problems are there in our product that we're not seeing? So there's more to that discovery. So I would also argue that the founder needs to be as attached to the salesperson and as receptive to pure feedback as possible, because that salesperson is going to be bringing back critical market data that founder is no longer seeing.
Absolutely. I mean, a salesperson listening to the customer is how products, change. I mean, the other thing I see in startups that sometimes doesn't get enough attention is kind of that market life cycle. So you've sold 5, 10, 15, 20 customers, you're kind of moving along. Some of them are paying, sort of introductory rates or whatever. But the killer to any business is if it churns, because
Yes.
if they start turning over, then you got to lap them. Investors aren't going to be excited. So you need to think about, how are you touching them at? You worked so hard to bring them in. You sent them a bunch of emails. You went on a bunch of calls. You did a bunch of demos. You built a feature for them. But if you're not then, after you've signed them up, regularly checking in, are the end users happy? Is the buyer happy? Is the process happy? Are we achieving the metrics? Drip campaigns, because you've got to fight that churn.
Yes.
There's so many solutions out there today. It's unbelievable.
Yes.
And so that's always the enemy, the hidden enemy.
The fortunes and the follow-up.
Right.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But listen, it is painfully obvious. We could talk all day. I think maybe we wrap up here. Is there anything else you'd want to cover before you do that, Ian? Because I legitimately feel like we could talk for hours.
It's Launchpad Ventures. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a pitch, in the sense that, Our whole thing is 175 members with very diverse backgrounds. We try to get deeply involved, press human capital against the companies we invest in. Even the companies that get in front of our group that we don't invest in, one of our processes is to return to them bullet points of what was right and wrong in their pitch, ideas for their business model, things to think about, and often connections. So we are a venture angel group, putting money to work, but we're really super active as a group in the community trying to help companies, and we really do. I mean, that's part of our interviewing process because we look for that DNA in our members. We just are you interested in helping the ecosystem?
That is so huge. VCs get a bad rap as being soulless bankers, but and I won't pretend I know all of them, but all of the ones that I know are always giving back in the community, and all of them are also former founders. They had their big win. They don't want to do another startup. They get involved in the VC world, and all of them are active founders. And gosh, the old saying of dumb money, if you're going to take money from somebody, make sure it's somebody that can help you on your journey. Maybe they've been down the same path. Maybe they can open doors for you. Maybe they can offer you advice. Something other than the check, because there's other checks out there. So, yeah, I think that's great.
Absolutely.
That's great. Awesome. Well, listen, let's wrap up here. Where can folks get in touch with you, Ian?
Well, Launchpad Ventures website, if they're not familiar, but directly to me, it's just Ian, which is IAN at launchpadventuregroup.com. That's my email. Feel free to reach out. I am on LinkedIn as well. So whatever works best for you. Or they can all just call you and then you call me.
That works. I'll take that call. Hey, if they're calling from my audience, I'm always happy to talk to them.
I like that.
In all honesty, though, so that information will be in the show notes as always. So if you see this on YouTube, on the YouTube channel, or Apple or Spotify or wherever, just click on the show notes. You'll be able to see Ian's email address. And let me know. I'd love to have Ian back on the show. I'd love to have you back. I didn't mean to speak to you as though you weren't here. Speak to the audience there for a second. I'd love to have you back on. I think we've got a ton more that we could cover.
Yeah, no, I think we both have the gift of gab and a lot of experience to share. So I welcome the opportunity. Let's make sure your audience saw value in what we gave today.
Awesome. That sounds wonderful. Thank you again. And for you folks out in the audience, as always, until we talk next week, make sure you're making something awesome and that your startup is doing well. Thank you.